Welcome to the NRA School Recycling Club Town and Gown webinar, Back to the Earth, How to Recycle Organic Material. Yard trimmings and food residuals together constitute 27% of the U.S. municipal solid waste stream. That's a lot of waste to send to landfills when it could become useful and environmentally beneficial compost instead. Composting offers obvious resource management benefits, creates a useful product from organic waste that would otherwise have been landfilled. This workshop, available for all age groups, explains how composting works and how to make it work. Welcome, community educators and environmental ambassadors. Development of this presentation is credited in part to USDA Rural Development. The USDA 2017 grant program goals are so that each group is equally well versed in the importance of indoor air quality and proper supply for purchasing and cleaning supplies, toxic substance handling, storage, and disposal. 2. To take down the wall that can exist between town and schools by encouraging increased cooperation in school and waste reduction and pollution prevention programs that benefit the entire community, primarily hazardous waste management, materials management. And expand participation in NRA's education programs through online learning. Our hope is that the cross-training program, appropriately titled Town and Gown, will create a solid connection between decision makers, solid waste operators, and schools to reduce redundancies in waste hauling, save money for the towns, and facilitate the removal of potentially hazardous waste in schools and homes. Thanks to the USDA Rural Utility Service, the program training is free. The goal of the program is for the trained participants to work together on creating a safer environment, knowledgeable staff on the proper storage and handling of hazardous materials, and working in conjunction on solid waste issues. Once you have completed the webinar, please email info@nrra.net to receive a link to an evaluation. Once you submit the evaluation, that helps us understand your knowledge and your intention to assist your community with managing hazardous waste materials, we will send you a certificate of achievement. If you have any technical difficulties during this program, please send us an email at info@nrra.net. So about NRA, in 1981, there were 4 New Hampshire municipalities that founded the New Hampshire Resource Recovery Association to provide a clearinghouse for current up-to-date information and a source of technical and marketing assistance in the general areas of waste reduction and recycling. Now we're called the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, and this still applies today, 37 years later. We are primarily in the Northeast, assisting communities by offering advice in the marketplace for the entire solid waste management stream, everything from trash to construction and demolition debris, to freon removal, to recycling from single stream and contracts with your individual material vendors. We are your one-stop shop for all things recycling. Since this is a Town and Gown production sponsored by USDA, I wanted to share with you the operator training programs offered by NRA. They are called MOM meetings, for members, operators, marketing monthly meetings. They are for facility operators and volunteers to meet and discuss waste industry topics. In addition to MOM meetings, NRA conducts operator training workshops and facility tours several times a year that can be used for continuing education credits toward transfer facility operator certifications and renewals where applicable. Whether an operator or school teacher, today's webinar is eligible for professional development credits if you complete the 10-question evaluation, which you can receive if you email info@nra.net, and then we'll be able to give you your certificate. The workshops listed here will be available on the NRA website for additional training opportunities. Please check back on our website to see when these are available. We have an awesome school club program that spans the nation and offers K-12 classroom workshops, technical assistance for supervisors and school administrators. The club produces a monthly newsletter, we recently published curricula that ties resource recovery lesson plans with the National Common Core standards, and we put on an annual school recycling conference. As previously mentioned, the club offers a wide range of workshops and school technical assistance programs that are designed to help schools improve recycling, waste reduction, clean out harmful chemicals, and evaluate trash and recycling practices. Check out the website for descriptions of workshops and pricing at schoolrecycling.net. We welcome schools to become members of our club, the School Recycling Club. Please email or call us regarding membership. Workshops will be available online for educator and waste operator training. Regarding these workshops here: Healthy Home, Clean Waters, Waste Equals Global Climate Change, Back to the Earth, and Garbage Gorillas. The annual conference and expo is a 2-day event jam-packed with workshops, speakers, exhibits, and more. The second day of the conference combines solid waste professional training with activities and workshops for school staff and for students. We'll now start the main presentation of the workshop, which explains how composting works and how to make it work in the school, at school, or in the backyard. Some of the images may seem elementary or basic to higher grades, but the information benefits everybody. Saving the world by keeping organic materials out of the landfill and reusing it for gardens and landscaping to replenish the soil. Good soil is somewhat difficult to define because it depends on the needs of the particular user. In general, though, good soils emanate from 5 key roles in our ecosystem. They provide a medium for plant roots and supply nutrients to plants. Soils control the fate of the hydrologic cycle or water cycle. They act as recyclers, processing waste products and dead bodies of plants and animals. Soils provide a habitat for a host of living organisms, from mammals to reptiles and microscopic organisms. Soils play an important role in human engineering activities such as road construction and building materials. So, composting is a mixture that consists largely of decayed organic matter and is used for fertilizing and conditioning land. You may be familiar with composting if you compost in your backyard, school, or drop-off facility. There are multitudes of ways to compost, some of which will be explored today. So it can be turned into a nutrient-rich soil called humus, which can be returned to the earth to grow new things. It's no longer rotting food. It shouldn't stink. It shouldn't be slimy. It's just beautiful, rich soil. Also, we don't want to confuse humus, which provides nutrients for plants, with hummus, the food product that we find in grocery stores made of chickpeas. Composting provides an opportunity for students and teachers to interact with the natural world. It teaches how soil, the basis for life on Earth, is created. Composting demonstrates the processes involved in the nutrient cycle. Given the right conditions, a balance of air, water, carbon, and nitrogen, decomposer organisms break down food scraps and yard waste into fresh, fertile humus that can be used to grow plants on school grounds. The cycle of life is completed when these plants are added to the compost pile in the fall. Definition of composting. Another definition for you: a mixture of decayed or decaying organic matter. Compost is usually made by gathering plant material, such as leaves, grass clippings, and vegetable peels, into a pile or bin and letting it decompose as a result of the action of aerobic bacteria, fungi, and other organisms. So compost and composting. Compost is the product that comes from the action of composting. It is nature's way of recycling. It happens naturally in the forest through the decomposition process. We can make it happen under controlled conditions to create a soil amendment that can be used to enrich and revitalize the earth's soil. It takes 5 basic steps to make compost. Going in clockwise direction on the graphic here. 1, a balanced supply of carbon and nitrogen. So on the picture, leaves and grass. It's called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. 2, enough moisture to permit biological activity without hindering aeration. So we want to have enough moisture. 3, adequate time and space for curing the compost. So you want to have enough space there for aeration and time for the compost to cure. 4, adequate mixing of organic materials to provide the nutrients needed for microbial activity and growth. And 5, particle size and surface area to maintain temperatures that encourage vigorous microbial activity and oxygen levels that support aerobic decomposition. Composting involves more in-depth processes, but for the classroom and for today, we'll stick to the basics in order to understand what exactly composting involves. So we'll take a look at these 3 vocabulary words. Organic matter is basically anything that was once alive. Vegetables, leaves, dead animals are all examples of organic matter. This is important to note when thinking about what you want in your compost pile. Is it potentially hazardous? Was it once alive but may take longer to break down? You may not want every kind of organic matter in your pile, but it could be suitable for other forms of composting, which we'll explore today. Decomposition is the process by which organic matter breaks down into smaller parts, which turns food into other organisms. This video shows decomposition in action and usually grabs the attention of students. The watermelon decomposition video shows what a watermelon would look like decomposing outside of the compost pile. Have students describe what is happening, what they see, and what they might smell if they could smell this process. Ask students if they think the watermelon would decompose faster or slower if the watermelon were in the compost pile. And it's a great example of what would happen if you don't turn your pile over. It tends to rot in place and get kind of slimy and stinky. So this is just a great hands-free activity that you can watch without getting too dirty. Aerobic means something that needs oxygen to live. Almost all living things and living processes need oxygen. So now's a good time to do an activity exercise with your students. All you have to do is ask them to get up, and you can do this yourself during a presentation. Is get up and just stretch and move around a little bit, and have the students or attendees describe kind of what is happening. So we're getting warmer, we're needing more oxygen to move around. So, and then we'll relate this to our compost pile. Things are moving around, things are warming up. That is why when you touch your compost pile, if the process is working correctly, it'll be warm from all the living things inside. So these are the 3 words: organic matter, decomposition, and aerobic. Basics that you'll need to know for when starting your compost pile. So organic matter, anything that was once alive. Decomposition, rotting, when organic matter rots and breaks down to be recycled. And aerobic, requiring oxygen. Here are 3 things that are important to the decomposition process. We have water, oxygen, and compost critters. But what is a compost critter? There are many kinds of microorganisms in a compost pile. Here are the 3 kinds of bacteria you will find in a compost pile. They are invisible to the eye. Bacteria and microorganisms are vital to breaking down compost material. These bacteria work at different temperatures. Starting from the top of that graphic there are thermophiles, which survive within a range of 110 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Mesophiles survive between 40 and 110, and saprophiles survive at 0 to 70, which is the coldest temperatures. The most efficient critters, which will be working in your compost, need temperatures around 150. If your school or community has a compost system, try measuring the temperature by changing variables such as water, carbon, greens, pile turning, etc. It's a great way to learn what the optimal ratios are and how to maintain the compost system, as well as integrate class lessons. These are the next level of smaller compost critters. You saw the fungi and molds at work on the watermelon. Fungi and actinomycetes. In addition to bacteria, they are doing their work. Cold temperature fungi are breaking down cellulose, starches, proteins, and lignin. Actinomycetes are part of bacteria and part fungus. They operate at medium temperatures at the outer edges of the compost pile. They are easy to spot in large clusters. They are the cobwebs that give the fresh dirt smell because they oxygenate the pile. The green mold is anaerobic, which will cause a foul odor. So think about what comes next in the food chain. What eats all these little critters? Here are some of the larger critters. They are called macroorganisms. They dig, chew, digest, and mix material. They increase the surface area, produce more food for microorganisms. Even their excrement becomes a meal for the smaller ones. They are still pretty small. Note the dime next to the pseudoscorpion. Many of the larger critters have a symbiotic relationship with the smaller critters, meaning they need each other to survive. What larger animals might eat these compost critters, such as birds, frogs, snakes, chickens, etc.? Here we have our compost food chain. We start with the microorganisms eating the organic material, move to the smaller critters, up to the larger critters, and so on. Everyone has a job to do in this chain. You are creating a micro-community in your compost. It is always changing and it has natural checks and imbalances. You intervene when the oxygen, moisture, or compost content are out of balance. Otherwise, the microorganisms will continue to rule their world. So, how do we do this? How do we compost? You can turn your food scraps into rich humus for your garden. It is amazing how nature turns this food waste into beautiful soil. Composting is relatively easy, but how long does this take? It really depends on what you do and what you want to do. There is a lot of information online, books you can order. You can contact your local cooperative extension to learn more about composting. But from Plow and Hearth, they say, if you just put all your garden waste, kitchen scraps, grass clippings, and autumn leaves into a giant pile, you'd have good, usable compost deep within the pile in a year and a half or so. Most of us want compost sooner than that, and luckily, with the compost process, it can happen much sooner than a year. So thinking like a scientist, you can make it happen more quickly and improve the quality. Or you can just let it sit and let it happen. What is your goal? Length of time between let it sit composting and scientific composting depends on the ingredients and how you layer them. Ingredients such as ashes, organic kitchen scraps, grass clippings, straw, seaweed, or weeds. And then you have non-favorable or stubborn ingredients. So corn cobs would take longer to break down, citrus rinds, colored paper, diseased plants are unfavorable, or anything toxic or even that are not biodegradable. So making compost can happen quickly, but it can be a little bit harder. But it's not as hard as what it takes to bake a cake. So, what do we need to bake a cake? Composting can seem overwhelming, but it's all about the recipe, as you will find out. To bake a cake, you must have certain ingredients mixed in different amounts, and it has to cook for a certain length of time. What would happen if we used salt instead of sugar in the cake, or didn't cook it long enough? Let's see how a scientific composter mixes their ingredients. First, we have greens, vegetable and food scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, manure. Note, manure will get a reaction from students. Animal manure, animals that eat vegetation exclusively like cows, horses, goats, etc. versus human feces. Temperatures in the pile do not get high enough to kill the harmful bacteria in human waste. Also, dog and cat feces should not be used. They are omnivores, which means they eat almost everything. Like us, and their waste contains harmful bacteria and parasites. But why is manure important? Manure is a soil conditioner, high in nitrogen, which is released slowly when mixed with compost. It should not be used by itself, as it might burn the plants with too much nitrogen. So here we have our next layer in our compost cake. These are called the brown ingredients, although they're not always brown. So items such as cardboard, paper, leaves, or whatever carbon source you're using create space for the compost pile to breathe. They are creating those pockets of air inside your compost pile. So typically the ratio is 30 to 1. So 30 carbon to 1 nitrogen ratio. Carbon products are fluffy. Like I said, they provide air. You notice the napkin with the coffee ring? So that's okay to use for the compost bin. However, you don't want to use towels from anything like bathrooms or nurses' offices if you're composting at a school. Also, brown towels do not contain bleach. Newspapers are okay if they use soy ink. Do not use magazines or glossy paper as they contain petrochemicals and coloring. Please recycle those. So basically you want to use natural browns. So the cardboard and paper, leaves are great, straw or sawdust. So putting it together in layers. Start with lots of browns. You can add some finished compost or manure as a starter. Try not to concentrate one kind of material in any portion of the pile. From the book Let It Rot by Stu Campbell, he says as soon as decomposition really gets underway, the pile will shrink anywhere from 20 to 60%, depending on the materials that have been put into it. The best time to start a pile is in autumn, with fallen leaves and old plant materials. For faster composting, keep in mind that you will need 2 other areas to store browns and greens, so that's more favorable to have more storage for your browns and greens as your compost pile is processing. So there are many different ways, like we said, to compost. These are just some of the gadgets that are out there. You can spend 0 to very little money by just making a pile in your backyard or throwing it in the woods. You can spend very little by using old untreated wood or pallets or chicken wire. A black bin will run around between $50 and $75. A compost tumbler is a little bit more expensive. A three-section build your own can run the range from very inexpensive to very expensive depending on the type of wood, adding a cover to keep out the rain, critters, bears, skunks, etc. Keep in mind that in the winter months you'll want to build a larger pile to hold in the heat. That is if you want to be composting in the winter. To turn your pile, you can use a rake, pitchfork, shovel, or a special compost aerator tool. You can even purchase a thermometer to measure the temperature in the middle of the pile. For your home composting, you will want a small bucket with a lid to collect kitchen scraps before bringing them to your pile. So here we're looking at a windrow, which is a long, about 3 foot high pile of compost, and this is probably at a farm, and they have these machines called compost turners, which has an auger and it turns the whole pile very nicely. And if you're lucky, sometimes you can bring some of your food scraps there for them to turn into compost. But we'll talk about other commercial compost operations as well. So just to take a look at what happens on a commercial composting scale, here are examples of larger commercial composting operations capable of handling larger volumes and even automated systems, like in the above right photo, that provide ideal composting conditions by controlling moisture, turning the materials regularly, and containing the smells to produce compost even faster. Compost is a valuable resource that can be sold to gardeners and landscapers. So these type of operations take leaf and yard waste. They'll be taking a lot more material, and they have the machines to be able to turn the compost to make it a faster process and to regulate what exactly is being added to the compost to have a recipe like we were talking about with the cake. Thinking about a larger scale or community scale composting, each fall we're confronted with tons of leaves falling from trees on our lawns. Adding leaves to landfills wastes rich organic matter and adds to leachate, methane, and space problems. So in some states, like New Hampshire, we have banned leaf and yard waste from landfills. So they need to be composted or dealt with otherwise. And then thinking about on a scale, thinking about sewage, although water disposal of organic waste through sewage systems has many health and cost benefits, it has notable drawbacks. Pumped out of septic systems and municipal sewage plants, 25 billion gallons of sludge is produced daily in the United States. There are problems with composting sewage sludge. Human waste with household chemicals and detergents is flushed into septic or municipal systems, thereby mixing biodegradable materials with potentially hazardous elements. So sometimes sewage is composted, but it has to be done at an industrial scale and to state code and regulations. So this is just giving you an idea of what happens on a larger scale and what can be composted on a larger scale. And then we get to vermicomposting, which means composting with worms. Vermicomposting produces a more nutrient-rich soil additive than traditional composting because the worms are eating what's in the vegetables and green matter and then excreting a nutritive substance because they process it. They're basically little composters processing a very nutrient-rich substance. Having a vermicomposting system for a classroom is a great way for students to learn and get up close to learn about decomposition. The worms are like little class pets if allowed in the school and if it's kept clean and kept maintained, because you can easily attract bugs and critters and all that, but very simple to create. You can see this one's made out of a tub with some holes screwed in the side. There is a lot of information online about how to maintain these. So worms are another example of how we can decompose our food waste. So just looking at another way to dispose of food waste. If you do not have room for a compost area, consider feeding food waste to animals such as pigs, chickens, even goats shown here eating holiday trees. There may be restrictions and guidelines to follow, of course. For example, raw meat must be cooked before given to some farm animals to prevent disease, or just don't give them meat at all. There is no restriction on food and vegetable waste, but you will want to avoid products that are treated with pesticides or insecticides. I was trying to be careful about that, and some sources even recommend avoiding genetically modified organisms. This is also recommended for your compost pile. Again, it's really, not only going by state regulations, but if you're composting in your backyard, you just want to be safe about what you're putting in there. Using standard kitchen scraps is really, really safe to use. And just looking at animal feed, it gets a little bit more complicated. But if you have chickens, they will eat a lot of food scraps. They love that. They also will aerate your compost pile pretty well. So if you let them on there and have a go at it, they'll mix things up. But animals are just another way to divert our food waste. So the compost pile size. Why is size important? Well, we don't want it too big to turn and aerate easily, but we want it big enough to be able to stay warm. And why is that important? Remember our compost critters. We are maintaining an ecosystem for them. So it's big enough to insulate that for the compost living organisms while being small enough to easily turn and add more material. It's important to keep those living things alive, plus a more manageable chore for you. Just remember, our microorganisms need heat to do their job, and they do their job at different temperatures. It all depends upon how fast you want your organic waste to compost. Remember at the very beginning we mentioned saving the world in our own backyard? Well, composting actually does help reduce greenhouse gases. So composting is one way we can help fight climate change, sea level rise, or global warming. And just to touch on global warming or climate change for the classroom or for your attendees. So what do we know about climate change? We know that global warming creates the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide prevent heat from escaping the atmosphere, so the Earth heats up, which means ice caps are melting, the sea level rises, water and land temperature rises, storms intensify, basically geological processes are changing. According to the US EPA, carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas emitted through human activities. 2014, carbon dioxide accounted for 80.9% of all greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. It's also naturally present in the atmosphere. It's part of the Earth's carbon cycle, which composting is definitely part of the carbon cycle. But human activities are altering this cycle by adding more CO2 to the atmosphere and by influencing the ability of natural sinks, like cutting down forests. Whether you're at home, in the school cafeteria, eating out, what happens to the food that we don't eat on our plates? And what happens to that yard waste if we don't compost? Organic waste will most likely end up sitting in a landfill for a very long time. How can one student or school prevent climate change? We can take only what we need at mealtime, reuse our food and yard waste, keeping them out of the landfill where they produce greenhouse gases. Many states have already banned yard waste and food waste from landfill disposal. Here is a cross-section of a typical sanitary landfill. Modern landfills are lined so that leachate and dangerous chemicals cannot flow into the environment and harm potential drinking water sources. Leachate, which is the water that runs from the side, down through everything that could possibly be in a landfill and ends up at the bottom hitting that lining where it can either be treated before it can be let out into the environment. So if you think about all the stuff that could possibly be thrown away, we don't want that material ending up in our water system again. And organic materials in a landfill don't get oxygen, so it's an anaerobic condition that they need that oxygen to break down. So if you think about all that food waste, it's just going to sit there. Anaerobic decomposition produces methane, a greenhouse gas that can be 84 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. One way to kind of mitigate the methane that is being produced in landfills is by capturing it and turning it into an energy source. As you can see here, some is happening here in New Hampshire, but this is just kind of a short-term solution to our landfills. So according to the EPA, the most cost-effective way to stop climate change is to reduce our waste. This is kind of the typical trash can that you see in the United States. So at the highest we have paper, then we'll have food and yard waste, so both of those organic items, plastics, metal, wood, glass, and just other kind of random objects at the bottom. So compostable materials make up about almost 30% of the garbage produced by the average household. If we compost and recycle, we can reduce our waste by over 80%. Now, this is probably painting a more perfect picture, but it's making the point that the more we compost and recycle and reuse our products and not throw them in the trash, all we're going to be left with are maybe some plastic bags and plastic that can't be recycled. So now we'll look at the cost savings by reducing the amount of weight from food waste and recycling into our trash, into the landfill. So by removing those, we can see, for an example, the average cost per ton of trash. So let's say it's $100 per ton of trash. And we would divert recyclables, so meaning take recyclables out of that trash, out of that ton, by 87%. So, hypothetically, our new cost of trash would now be $13 per ton, simply by taking out of that weight. So, looking at it on a larger scale, if we produce 20 tons of trash, that'll cost us around $2,000, and diverting recyclables by 87% again, so everybody's working together and reducing that weight going into the landfill. Our new cost of trash would be $260. Now that looks a lot better than $2,000. I think any town would want to do that. So this is just a generic example. Market commodity prices for recyclables are always changing, as is the disposal and tipping fees for waste. So when we think about what's going on today in the past couple of years, the cost of recycling has actually risen, but it hasn't quite meeting the cost of how much it costs to put something in the landfill, so it still costs less. So when we look at this example, you can take it with a grain of salt just because of the way that the market prices are always changing. But we constantly want to be reducing our waste, reducing what we're putting into a landfill. Composting is just one way people can reduce their carbon footprint but produce valuable nutrient fertilizer. Thank you for participating in one of NRA's School Club modules. We hope that you will help share the information that you learned today with the community, with your classroom. If you're a transfer station operator, we hope you share it, back in your communities. Even if you're not composting or can't compost right now, you can definitely educate the public about it, and as a future project, or thinking about how to reduce our waste, or even educating the public about composting in their own backyard if that is available to them. So if you have any questions about the module, you're always welcome to contact us. And thank you for participating. Thank you again, and remember to email info@nrra.net to make sure you receive a link to a survey in order to receive your certificate of participation. Thank you again, and as always, give us a call or email us.